that's absolutely important. And that's exactly why it's so important to have representation and somebody knows how to negotiate.
Welcome back to another episode of the Shared Practices podcast. I have with me here today my co-host for the season, Dr. Jonas Ashbaugh. How's it going, Jonas?
Hey, fantastic. How about you?
Pretty good. We got some people might call this dry, but we got an episode on banking today. In season 2, I think I did a total of 4 episodes on financing. In this season, I'm going to keep it to 1. So give everyone a break from talking about interest rates. And so today on the podcast, I have Morgan Stump with Lendeavor. And it's an interesting, really great company and a really great guy. And he has a lot of experience working with startups. And so we'll go ahead and jump straight to the interview. And I think you guys are really going to like it. He has previous, experience at Wells Fargo, and now he's with Lendeavor. And so he has a lot of experience on startups and lending in general. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right to the interview with Morgan Stump from Lendeavor. I have with me here today Morgan Stump. And Morgan's a very interesting character. He was actually at Wells Fargo and recently left for a company that we had on the podcast at the end of season 2, Lendeavor. Really, really fascinating company, great story. And I wanted to have him here on today to talk about startups and, all that is involved on the lending side of things. I think, loans are a lot more difficult and challenging on startups. And so I wanted to have a banker on who has a lot of experience with that. And so I want to welcome to the show today, Morgan Stump.
Thank you, George. It's really nice to be here. And I've had so many great conversations with a lot of your doctors, since James was on the podcast last month. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, I've heard great things from everybody who's contacted Lendeavor or whatnot about you specifically. So I wanted to have you on and talk about startups and lending. And so tell me a little bit about your background that our audience can get an idea.
Sure. So like you said, I was previously at Wells Fargo Practice Finance, and Wells Fargo has been kind of a constant player in the dental finance world for quite a few many years. They were previous to Wells Fargo acquiring them. They were known as Matchco, and then there was a series of acquisitions that led them to Wells Fargo. And worked there I was over there 7 years. And good folks, had a great time there. Built a great territory, but at the end of the day, I continue to feel like we could be doing things better. A number of ways in which we could be doing things better, but at the top of that list was from a technology standpoint. And, a lot of our first-time buyers and a lot of your listeners, I can tell you that, after speaking with so many of them, they're 30, 31, 32, 35 years old. And for me to spend an hour with them on my first call, which I try to do with most of my doctors, that first call is really important. It's a chance for them to get to know us to go ahead and find out more about them, their goals, their vision. And it's really kind of where everything begins, And so I would go to having that phone call with them, and then I would get their email address, and I would send them literally probably 5, 6, 7 PDFs that they would go in. Some of it would auto-populate. Some of it they'd have to print out. They'd have to sign it, have to scan it or fax it back. And then, then it comes down to security. A lot of people didn't want to send things over email, had a hard time accessing portals. So it by the end of the process of the loan, even if I did a great job setting appropriate expectations throughout, which is something I always try to do, the borrower was always fatigued. The doctor was fatigued. You've got a doctor that's not only managing their career, but they've also are going through the stresses of looking at becoming a first-time practice owner or starting up a practice, and that's stressful enough. And so to have to go through all this minutia with a big bank, it became really hard to just really meet the expectations that I set early on in that first phone call. So I met Lendeavor actually a few years ago, when they were just kind of basically dialing in their technology and really just focusing on getting the word out there that they're doing things differently. And I ended up meeting James, who's one of the co-founders. He's been really spearheading the sales for the last few years as well. Met him at a trade show a few years ago, a big dental trade show, and got to know each other. And I just really have respected the way that they've built their company. And they've really kind of done it the opposite of how a big bank does it. Instead of really building up the salespeople and the outside sales folks and undermanning the operations, they've actually been focusing all of their investor money for the first few years on the technology and on the operations, where, like I said, James was really the only guy, quote unquote, as the outside salesperson. So what that means is, we have proprietary software. So your listeners that I've spoken to, that we've spoken to, have already seen that. They've been going to the portal. It's our own loan portal, basically, and they log in. It's a dashboard. They're able to go on in 15, 20 minutes, get completely pre-qualified, whether or not they've got a target practice in mind, or if it's a refinance or an expansion, et cetera. They're able to go in, and within 15, 20 minutes, we see everything. And we're able to basically make sure that, A, it's a good fit, and B, that we've got a good pathway to success for them. And so within 15, 20 minutes, when they complete that, I get notified when that's completed. I'm able to go in there and just kind of look at them and set up a phone call. And instead of just kind of going in blindly to our first phone call, now I've got all this information in front of me and we're hitting the ground running. So, it ends up creating a much more user-friendly experience for the doctors. The ease of process is, the way that it should be, because banks these days, let's be honest, it's somewhat of a commodity. The rates are very much the same across the banks. We're right there with all of those big banks. So what it should come down to is, is the loan process a big drag on you? No, it shouldn't be like that. So our technology allows us to advance things very quickly. We're often at credit decisions, in a matter of days, and we're able to approve loans before banks are even to get out a term sheet or a proposal. So that allows our doctors to focus on the truly important things, which is preparing to become an owner, educating themselves, listening to your podcast, and just putting themselves in the right frame of mind to be successful instead of worrying about a loan or a bank. So I know that was a little bit long-winded, but I'm pretty passionate about it. And just being over here now for a number of months, this is why we came over, and we're walking the walk at this point.
No, I love it. And, I think banking is kind of like, I'll compare it to the lease when you're buying a practice. It's like, it shouldn't be a hassle and it shouldn't be a problem. It should be straightforward. But if it ever comes back, it could go really poorly if you don't have it done properly. And so I think that's kind of the way banking is as well. You need it to go smoothly and to be like a minimal part of the process. And I think the big elephant in the room for the listener now, season 3, we're talking about startups. And at this time, Lendeavor does not offer startups. And that's kind of why I wanted to get you on, because, you guys are in the process of trying to build out that product. But, you came from somewhere where you guys did startups. And so, what are the challenges that banks have? Not a lot of banks offer startup packages. So
Sure.
Why is it that banks maybe don't fear or maybe don't love startups as much?
Oh man, I could probably talk about this one for a while. And that's a great question. Startups to me are very important. I look forward to the day that we can offer them, and hopefully that's not too far out. I know that it's currently in discussions. We want to make sure that we put a great program together. Like everything else that we've rolled out, we've ran it, we've tested it before we roll it out to market. And we've actually have completed some startups early on because they're a project. There's multiple moving parts, multiple disbursements. You're dealing with all kinds of vendors that you're paying out directly. So that's not something that you just turn on the faucet and say, hey, we're going to start doing startups now. We need to be good at it before we roll it out. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now. For me, I personally was pretty passionate about doing them. And that was probably one of the hardest things to leave behind when I was at previous employment. And it's something that I'm in close contact with our leadership on, and I know it's a priority for them. So let me kind of switch gears to your actual question. Why aren't too many banks offering startups right now? And I think the short answer is, if you think about it, when you compare the two ways that you can become an owner, either acquiring a business that already has existing cash flow, already has existing goodwill, already has existing staff in place, versus a scratch startup scenario, where that all has to be created almost out of thin air. From a banking perspective, one is more risky. And so right now, we've also got a seller's market out there. I think as your listeners understand, the sellers seem to be in the driver's seat in most markets, meaning that, they're demanding 80-90% of gross receipts, for most acquisitions. And so what we're seeing and we're running into is a pure demographics thing. You've got the baby boomer generation out there that's 65 plus. A lot of them got hit pretty hard, in 08, 09, 2010, 401ks wiped out. So a lot of them held on to their practices and are working deeper into their career than we've ever seen before. So what that's causing is now it's a seller's market where there's not a ton of inventory out there. And when there is inventory, it gets snatched up in a heartbeat. And so banks are fat and happy right now. The B of A's of the world, the Wells Fargo's of the world, go down that big bank list and, they're fat and happy and they can basically choose to write more acquisitions. It's the riskier the loans. And quite frankly, it's the easier to underwrite and then service. So I think you're kind of facing multiple things as to why banks are choosing not to really offer the startup program. As far as Lendeavor goes, it is important to us, but you also got to understand, as a young direct lender, we're trying to get some depth into our portfolio right now. And being the fact that startups are a little bit on the riskier side from when we look at portfolio data, I was in on those meetings. I know what across the board and through our partnership, through Wells Fargo's partnership with the ADA, I was able to kind of get those stats and really kind of understand, a failure rate between an acquisition versus a startup. And it is higher. And so our goal at Lendeavor is to be around for a very long time. We've got deep pockets. We are private. We are going to be around a long time, but we want to do it right. And so we're getting some depth right now in our portfolio, filling them with, the best deals out there. I call it A paper. We want the best borrowers, great credit scores, great practices. And right now we're working on putting that startup program together. So it was kind of like a situation where we wanted to really kind of learn how to walk before we could run on multiple levels. So that's kind of where we've landed so far.
Makes a lot of sense. One question I had for you. When you talk about the baby boomers and you talk about those older dentists, I'm very well aware of the fact that it's a seller's market. And I'm totally with you on that. But in my perspective, wouldn't that make the banks less happy because that means that there are less deals being done because there's not an availability of practices right now? Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, well, yes and no. There are a lot of even though it feels like the inventory is low, there's never been more practices selling every day, right? When you look at it from a true number standpoint. So what I think we're running into is, there's a lot of hungry young buyers coming out nowadays that want to own a lot sooner than previously. You've got your doctors coming out, after 4 years of dental school with $350,000, $400,000, $500,000 of student loan debt. And I know that it's funny, that generation does like to talk about the millennials a lot. They think that they come out, I've heard it. I've given a lot of seminars, a lot of CE seminars on transitions where we've got buyers and sellers in the room together. And the baby boomer generation, the mentality and the thought process is that the millennials don't want to work hard. I've heard it time and time again. And I push back and I say, listen, they might only want to work 4 days a week, but they can offer every procedure out there. They want to be an owner in 1 year out of school, and they come out hungry and more built to run a business than the previous generations did. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect, there's a 2-generation gap. And so I think there are just as many practices now being sold through transition as any other time. And so you're seeing banks that are trying to cherry pick those transitions, instead of really getting comfortable in that startup space.
Okay, that makes more sense, Morgan. And before this is totally a tangent that we're going on here, but I one more question on it. How much longer do you think the boomer, that we're holding on to their practices is going to last?
Oh man, I can't see it lasting much more than 5 more years. I mean, if you look at purely the generational range of age, and you look at somebody trying to balance getting out in time where they're able to sustain a practice and not see declining revenues and not going from 4 to 3 to 2 days a week, where now, 3 years ago, they were doing 1.4 million in collections. Now they're doing 900,000 in collections, but they still want to sell that thing for 1.2 because I promise once you get in here and you work really hard, then you're going to turn this thing back around. Well, that's tough for a bank because we don't know what's happened there. We don't know that necessarily the decline is just due to the seller taking his foot off his gas. We don't know if there's reputational risk in the community that we don't know about. So that creates a really tough situation for a bank to lend to. So, hopefully that generation is going to the CE courses. They're working with transition specialists and their CPAs to realize, you're going to get a lot more out of your practice when you sell it close to the peak rather than when it's declining. And just from a pure generational standpoint, I don't see how a doctor can work into 75, 80 years old and really sustain that unless they bring in an associate, which, typically they're not real comfortable doing it at that end of the career.
Okay, I'm with you. And I appreciate you going down that tangent with me. Turning our gears back to startups. So, as somebody with experience doing a lot of startups, what are some of the things that you think kind of take us through that process? I guess from the banking perspective, take us through the process that a doctor goes through when they do a startup loan.
Absolutely. And I think it's always important to have that a doctor surrounds themselves with a good team, dental focused industry experts, whether it be attorneys, whether it be contractors, whether it be a CPA. You want to be careful, talk to a lot of people, line up personalities, understand the kind of fees that are being charged, because once you start involving all kinds of people, those are expenses that you've got to keep in mind, especially with a startup. So just make sure you work with people that you trust. If you've got people in the industry that have had successful startups, I think that's a great place to start. Any lender that you're working with or any CPA, I know you, George, personally have so many contacts as well. Always go through a trusted resource. And, that's best through family or friends. But most importantly, I want to back up actually right there. I'm not saying use family or friends. I'm saying go through them for referrals for like and similar projects that have already been completed, especially with contractors. It's so important to be able to go and physically see the work that they've completed. So I would say, A, make sure that you're building a good team as a startup. B, you got to understand that you're starting something, like I said earlier, out of kind of thin air. And so you want to make sure that you have the ability to pay your bills as you are starting up. And so I know that any lender out there right now that's doing startups, and nationally, that's really pretty much B of A and Wells Fargo, I believe, they are going to require that you've got some sort of outside income. And typically that means associating a couple of days a week outside of the practice that you're starting up. And so I know that's something that some people are a little bit resistant to. And I know sometimes, depending on the market size that you're in, that might be difficult. It might require some drive time. But the fact of the matter is, you're going to be starting up from scratch. You're going to be working hard to just get patients to walk through that door. And there's nothing more stressful than having overhead and no income coming in. And so these banks are requiring, and likely we would as well when we roll out our startup product, that there is some sort of outside income in place. That can sometimes be a spouse. We're going to want to see it that a doctor is likely working and gainfully employed either way. But if there is a spouse that's drawing income and they're willing to be a co-applicant, we can typically add their income into the cash flow. So I would say point number 2, after building yourself a good team, is just making sure that you understand where the income is going to be coming from, because those projections that you kind of pencil out, those are projections. They're an estimated or an educated guess. And so you want to be able to make sure that you can pay your bills with your outside income. Number
Morgan,
3.
Do you mind if I interrupt you there before number 3? A lot of points
Not
I wanted to discuss on too. First being, my co-host for the season, Jonas Ashbaugh, he had his associateship and whatnot, and then his startup kind of took off right when he opened. And then he dropped his associateship pretty early on, knowing that he saw the trajectory of his startup and wanted to focus on that. Now, my question for him, and I don't think we kind of either of us knew, was the bank itself, do they have a follow-up that they do on you, or is it just if you're making your payments, then you're good?
So most banks that are doing startups, they are going to have kind of a milestone program, where you're touching base with them monthly, whether it's over the phone or it's just kind of a one-page document that you fill out saying, how many new patients did you see? What are your collections expected to be? What's your production expected to be? That's typically kind of a monthly drill that they do for their startup programs. And I appreciate that. Like, a lot of doctors kind of roll their eyes and, they don't necessarily want the lender, being in their business after they close the loan. But, you guys should understand that whether it's for the right reasons or not, and I'm telling you that it usually is, a bank does want to see that you're successful. And doctors that avoid looking at those numbers and really understanding what those numbers are, those are the doctors that kind of get lost, in the clinical side of things instead of running a business. And so I like the drill of that. So yes, the bank is following up. But what I'll tell you is, we're going to just want to see that you're able to sustain yourself in your own practice. And so, if you're the person at the front line, so we're going to trust you and say, if you were working 2 and 2, so 2 in your practice, 2 outside practice, but now you think that the schedule allows you to go 3 and 1, then the lender should support you in that. What we don't want to see is just getting antsy. This is the doctor's baby. If you hold that thing too tight, it might just kind of squeeze out of your arms. And so we often see doctors wanting to step away from their outside employment a little bit early. So just make sure that if you're going to be doing that you don't have huge gaps in your schedule, that you're not sitting around all day. Because again, I'm a huge believer that the mental side of being a business owner is very important. And being stressed out and, leaving that outside income too early is one of the main causes of an eventual default. And it just kind of builds itself on each other if you think about it, because once you become known as a practice owner, it's going to become more and more difficult for you to secure outside income. And so if you're able to line that up ahead of time with somebody that understands that you're starting up your own practice 15 minutes away and they're not threatened by that, then they're likely going to work with you to make, to be flexible and eventually go from 3 to 2 to 1 day a week or whatever the schedule is. So I just would say, just be careful, in those situations. Give yourself an out. If you go back into the practice and you find yourself kind of, heck, maybe I'm not ready for 3 or 4 days a week. Make sure that you've got the opportunity to go make some money somewhere else. And, you doctors are pretty responsible folks. You guys have a tight knit network, and usually you guys can make those situations work. So that would be my advice.
But first, a word from our sponsor, Q Optics. I've got with us here Brent Downs, who is the director of sales at Q Optics, and he's got a little bit of advice for that new dentist going to their first conference.
We'll call her the light bulb lady. This goes back to the early 90s. I was in a booth right next to her, and this lady was legendary in how she would attract people into her booth.
Okay.
And, the unsuspecting dentist within a matter of just a few seconds would have his bags on the ground and 2 light bulbs in his hands.
And we're talking like color-corrected ceiling lights or something?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And she was just a master at communicating, but she was also one of the most pesky sales reps that I've ever met in my life. It got to the point where she was around for years. People would see her walking down the aisle and they would literally turn around to avoid her. And it made for just a miserable experience for me.
Working next to her.
Exactly. I didn't have a whole lot of people to talk to that week. And the point is, the lesson that I learned from that is just, don't be afraid to say no. You're not going to hurt any feelings. It's just business, and they've got a job to do. Maybe they're a little bit aggressive in how they go about it, but sure. You have to protect your self-interest. So no is a good thing to say.
It's a good little word to learn, and you're never going to hurt anyone's feelings just by learning a little bit and moving on.
Exactly.
Awesome. If you're ready to upgrade your magnification experience, send an email to sales@qoptics.com. using the promo code SP16 for $100 off a pair of loupes or $300 off a loupe and light combo. They will figure out who the rep in your area is and schedule a demo for you where you can get fitted, try them out, see for yourselves. In worst case scenario, you say no. Not a big deal. Q Optics. Have a better look.
Yeah, I think you touched on it, but definitely the biggest tendency that, people keep talking about is that wanting to quit your job, but just making sure that you're ready to do so, and that it's a big risk quitting. So make sure you're prepared on that. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about that you touched on in that second point was the actual so you kind of talked about it, you have to drive far for your associateship. I just kind of wanted to touch on maybe not relevant to this episode, but just the idea that you're going to have a non-compete associated with your associateship, and to try to limit how many non-competes you sign. because then that really limits where you're able to open a startup. And I think one of the hardest things for a startup is finding a location. And so the more flexibility you have on where you can look, the better that will be for you. And so I think when Morgan was talking about driving a far distance to go to your actual startup or to go to your job, I would just keep in mind, we talked about it previously on the podcast, but just making sure that you know where you're working, where your non-compete is, and that fits into your idea of where you want to own.
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, when you're thinking about a startup, that was going to be my third point of what's really important with a startup. And so it's kind of a segue, demographics, right? Demographics can mean, two things, the market that you want to go in and penetrate, and then also where you want to live. And so in an ideal world, in my opinion, I think the most successful practice owners and the doctors that I've seen ramp up the quickest in a startup are those who are members of the community. Whether that means you're involved with the local grade schools or high schools. I mean, I've seen some really cool things with doctors that are ingrained in their local community that have allowed them to ramp up really quickly. And so understanding the demographics and most importantly, where do you and your family want to live for a long time? And then basically draw a circle around that area, 10-mile radius, and try to figure out, okay, if I'm going to get an associate position and plan to work somewhere for a year or so, and if I'm out of school for a year or two and I just want to get to work, have your end game in mind while you're making these plans, and don't box yourself out of the area that you actually want to go in and plant your flag. So George, that's a great point, and that's why it's kind of a pain in the tail. But if you've got to drive a little ways, just make sure it's sustainable. I've seen some pretty long commutes that can grind down a doctor, but make it reasonable. But just make sure that you don't box yourself out of the space you want to be in.
Yeah, we had another doctor on the season, Dr. Todd Peterson. I think his commute was like a couple 100 miles, but that was not out of that reason. It was out of necessity. But yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right on that. And let's segue to number 3 then. I want to hear you talk about demographics a little bit. It's a topic of interest of mine, so I'm curious to get into this discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, demographics on the face of it seem pretty simple, and some of the demographic reports that I've seen are pretty simple. But there are some great services out there that can really dig into the numbers and layers of numbers. Where's a practice or where's a community going to be, not just right now, but in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years? Where are the growth boundaries? Where are the schools going? All of these things are going to be key to the kind of practice that you want to grow and open. You've also got to understand the income levels. If you're planning and you want to be in a fee-for-service practice, don't go into a Medicaid demographic. I mean, some of this stuff seems like common sense, but I've seen everything. And so this is, again, why it's really important as a scratch startup to be aligning yourself with the right people. Whether it's a consultant that has done a lot of startups, whether it's a CPA who focuses on dental, that's helping you with your due diligence. This is stuff that you guys, don't be afraid to ask for help on. And as far as demographics go, I think the best place to start is there are quite a few, there are companies out there right now that are growing. I don't know, George, if you'd like me to even mention names, but there are companies out there, commercial real estate companies, who all that they do is really try to represent doctors. They're healthcare specific. And these folks, as part of their offering, as part of their services, they should be providing, legitimate demographic reports. And that kind of would be a segue to number 4. And I don't mean to bounce around on you because we can go back to demographics, but align yourself with a commercial real estate expert that knows this space is invaluable. And there's no reason not to. Their bonus or their commission is usually built into the lease and paid for by the landlord. And so when you're looking at a scratch startup where demographics are absolutely crucial, and you guys need to, focus on trying to ramp up quickly, and you're working 2 jobs and all that, going somewhere where you can have a quick ramp up, good visibility, those are going to be the things that can make or break it, really. And so to have somebody working for you that understands an area, understands the demographic, is representing just you, then that's just an absolute necessity. So demographics are crucial. You just have to know where to go to get them. And it's typically the commercial real estate broker is the best place to start.
And then Morgan, I'm more than happy. Do you have any suggestions for our listeners on that front? Any names they could look up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it depends on the market that you're in. I know that Car Healthcare Realty is obviously kind of the big 800-pound gorilla in the space nationally. But then there's also, if you're down in the Southwest, the Arizona Healthcare Realty, they are expanding and looking to basically go into other markets as well outside of Arizona, and they're doing a heck of a job. And so it's one of those things that whichever market you're in, I know that you cast a really wide net, George. I've seen your doctors are all over the country. So it's really important to talk to your local folks about, and again, talk to the dentists that have already been there, those that are already practice owners that have already got lease space, and ask them who represented them and who did a good job. And as long as you have your own representation, and this is something that they do on a day-to-day basis, you most likely can't lose.
Yeah, so maybe just your area, Healthcare Realty, Google search and see what you find?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And then back on the point of demographics, I'm not letting you off that easy, Morgan. So when I'm like the same way we talk about dental specific, professionals, I think that dental specific demographics company is super important, especially if you're doing a startup. I mean, I even recommend them for acquisitions as well. I like Dentagraphics as a company I really like.
Yes.
And so one of the things I think is most important is your dental office population ratio. Is that something that you guys as banks look at or care about? Because honestly, I think that might be one of the most important things.
Absolutely. And banks are going to be pulling their own demographic report on a startup typically. And it's somebody that they usually have a relationship with that, does it for, this is what they do, but then the bank partners with them at a kind of a bulk rate. So, we're going to be ordering 50 of these from you a month, then we get a discount on them. And so oftentimes your lender will also be able to provide a really kind of a simple demographic report, but that is always one of the, that's going to always be on every demographic report, George, just because it is absolutely crucial. You got to understand, there's only so much market, so many slices of the pie, if you will. So you need to know where your competition is, who you're up against, and the ratio of population that you can target. And go ahead.
On that same topic, then, what rates? So obviously, like you had mentioned before, great point. You have to be in an area where people want to, the patients that you're looking for are there. You can't be doing a fee-for-service startup in a low-income area. Stuff like that, I think is less obvious than people would realize. We see a lot of people make that mistake, but let's just assume you get that right. What dental office population ratio are you guys comfortable lending to? What ratio makes you guys scared? And then what ratio is an absolute red flag?
Well, I don't want to get into ratios too much. I mean, it's very market specific. It's very driven by insurances as well of the demographic. And so, our underwriters, given the situation, are typically going to dig into that on a case by case basis. So I don't think I would do you any service of trying to talk about any ratios here. However, this is what your team is going to really help you out with and really understand is, okay, let's dig into this market, based on where you want to plant your flag right here. It's realistic that you're going to draw from X amount of miles. In Las Vegas, that could literally be, 5 blocks because it could take you 10 minutes. Out in rural America, you might have people that are driving from 20 miles to come see you because there's only 3 within that radius. And so each market is very much different. So I think that you need to work with your partners, with your consultants to really understand that. And to be honest, banks are working nationally as well. And so underwriters, this is what you put in the business plan. And this is one thing that I talk to them about to include is talk about the target demographic, the ratios, because underwriters are sitting behind a desk. They've got Google. They're able to do a little bit of digging. They've got their own kind of smaller, less comprehensive demographic reports. So if you bring this information to them, I mean, just think about it from a human nature perspective. You're going to understand that this doctor has really taken time to understand where they want to go set up shop. And so I think it's a really important exercise for each doctor to step into on their own with their own team and come to their own conclusions on and present that to the bank because really that's going to be a more localized perspective, which the national banks can't get. So I know that's kind of a long-winded, non-specific answer, but each market is just so different. I don't want to try to box ourselves in.
No, thanks, Morgan. Yeah, long-winded, non-specific answer. That was, no, but I'm with you. I understand why you're giving that answer. From my perspective, as somebody who doesn't have to give that answer, I think I'll try to offer my opinion on it for what it's worth to our audience. In my perspective and numbers that I hear is that nobody likes the idea of doing a startup if your dental office population ratio is less than 3,000 to 1. If I were to do a startup, I would want it to be more to 4,000 to 5,000 to 1 because I feel like you can get a lot better opportunities with acquisitions. And so for it to be a worthwhile opportunity for me to do a startup, it would have to be really extraordinary. I know guys that won't do it less than 6,000 to 1. But again, those guys spend forever finding a location. You can make it work with less than that, but it's going to be an uphill battle. So that's my take on the subject. I wanted to leave somebody with, a solid answer there. But nonetheless, moving on to, I think, we have, somebody on here with a lot of lending experience in the startup space. What terms, I think let's move to the actual loan itself and
Sure.
What terms are important for a startup, especially with a low cash flow business up front. What types of things are important to see in the deal that would make you choose one bank over another? What kind of things should the doctors be looking for when they're looking at the applications and whatnot?
No, that's a great question, and I can give you more specifics with my answer on this one. Any bank that you work with right now for a startup is likely to offer a graduated payment schedule, and that's something that is important. Most lenders and most loan schedules allow for early pay down of the principal balance. So to get into a loan contract where your payment is escalating over time is going to be very attractive, and so. But not all of them are created equal. So I would tell every doctor, if you're going through a startup, I would be talking to at least 2 banks that can do startups and have a reputation for doing startups. 2 to 3 is probably a good amount. Any more than that, you're wasting your valuable time and likely confusing yourself at that point. And so on the startup front, comparing amortization schedules and George, help me out. Do you think everybody knows what an amortization schedule is?
No.
Okay, let me get into that really quick. So an amortization schedule actually outlays all of your payments month by month. And the reason why this is really important for a startup is these are project loans. So you're going to have a period of time in which you have access to your lease space where the contractor's in there, the vendor's in there, and you're going to be utilizing your guys' approval. So let's just kind of use an example. Let's say you're approved for $500,000 for your startup. You're going to be kind of going through that budget as your space gets built out, and you're not even going to be seeing patients yet. So you're going to be accessing your loan, but you're not going to be creating revenue to pay those bills. So interest is accruing during that period, but these banks aren't typically forcing you to make a payment. So let's say, your project takes 3 or 4 months, and let's just use an example of July 1st are the days that you're going to open the door. So July 1st comes around, you say to your bank, hey, I'm all done. I've used $500,000 or whether it's $475 or whatever it is. That's, the day that you open your doors, that's when that loan is going to basically get capped off and it's going to be turned into a term loan. And so it's going to convert into a 10-year fixed rate. I don't think any banks are really going much out further than that. So they approve you for 10 years. So now your doors are open. Well, it wouldn't be very fair for a bank to just start charging you your full principal and interest payment, because even though your doors are open, you're marketing, you're working your tail off to just get people to walk through the door. So they offer what's called a graduated payment schedule. So oftentimes, even the first 3 months after you open the doors, you don't even have a payment come due, and then the next 9 months or 12 months after that, depending on the lender, it's going to ramp up very slowly. So, you actually won't have your full principal and interest payment with most programs until year 2 or 3. So what that allows you to do is start marketing, getting patients to walk through the door. Meanwhile, you're still working outside your practice, earning income so that you can eat and build your practice up relatively stress-free. And as you go on, the payments will ramp up. Now, the reason why I say get an amortization schedule is, while it's a nice tool to have, the graduated payment schedule, it's really important to understand that interest is accruing during that time. And so every month that you don't make a full principal and interest payment, interest is likely going to be accruing. So oftentimes, for the first year, 2 years, you're not even paying down that loan at all. And so you need to have a good global perspective of what your loan is doing. And that's something you can attain through an amortization schedule. It literally, if you have a 120-month loan, which is 10 years, you're literally going to have 120 line items that show you exactly, A, what the payment is, B, how much principal is being paid down with that payment, and C, how much interest is being taken out of that monthly payment, in interest fees. And so banks it's kind of a smoke and mirrors game with the startups. A lot of them, will tell you, hey, you don't want to lock yourself into a high payment early on. So let's spread it out as long as we possibly can. And they start kind of sowing seeds of doubt into your head that you could afford these payments. And then meanwhile, interest is accruing that whole time. And so just be careful of that. Compare the amortization schedules. Try to find a good balance of protecting your cash flow early on, but not killing you long-term out of pocket. Because within a year or two, the vast majority of the startups are going to be self-sustainable. You're going to be in a position to want to pay down your debt, and you don't want to be locked into a loan, where you end up paying, a ton of interest over the life of the loan if you don't have to.
When most people think about a startup, they think that they are expensive and time-consuming. I'm here today to tell you that they are right, but it doesn't have to be. Starting a dental practice presents a list of challenges, but when it comes to making decisions about where to purchase your dental equipment, I recommend Dental Planet. Dental Planet provides affordable, comprehensive services that simplify the startup, expansion, or renovation process while dramatically improving your ROI of the entire project. If you need equipment, Dental Planet has new, factory recertified, and Dental Planet certified pre-owned digital imaging systems. As you know, a lot of your success as a startup is based on your ability to provide a great experience for your patients. The same can be said about Dental Planet. They provide telephone, email, and remote support, as well as multiple financing solutions. Dental Planet is even more affordable than many of their competitors. All products include a warranty backed by a nationwide network of service providers, along with expert sales consultants and technicians. Thousands of more items, including dental supplies, are also available when you use Dental Planet. Buying equipment for your startup doesn't have to be expensive with Dental Planet. You can save between 40 to 60%. See how easy and affordable upgrading, replacing, or expanding can be when you team up with Dental Planet. Just mention Shared Practices to get a discount on your already low prices. Learn more at dentalplanet.com. Again, that's dentalplanet.com. Again, mention Shared Practices to get a discount on your entire order. Now, I'm with you on that, and I also think it's nice, because I'm in the process of buying a practice, and I'm interest-only payments for, a while at the front end, and it's nice because, your principal is not changing per se, but you know exactly how much money you're wasting because it's exactly your payment. So I think that's nice on the front end too, but how long do those interest-only payments last for a startup typically?
Well, I can really only speak to a couple of programs. Just when I was at Wells, I was competing against B of A a lot, so I typically know both of those programs. And I guess the most common structure that you would see would be 3 to 6 months with absolutely no payment at all. Okay, and then another 6 months to another year on top of that of interest-only payments. Like you said, and George, that's a really good point because, these lenders do allow you to pay a certain percentage of the loan amount early if you want. And so even if you don't want to pay your full principal and interest payment, like let's say month 3 comes around and you're feeling good about things, even just paying that interest only payment is going to give you a really big peace of mind and in the long term save you a lot of money in interest. So the typical schedule is going to be 3 to 6 months of absolutely no payment, another 6 months of interest only payments. And then there's typically a period of time that can be 6 to 12 months after that, where it is now your full interest payment plus just a portion of the principal. So I know with Wells, you weren't hitting your full principal and interest payment till month 25. I think with B of A, they try to stretch you out a little bit longer than that, but it's apples to apples basically.
Wow, that's pretty far. Month 25.
Month 25. Yep.
Whoa. So then on the back end, years, 3 through 10 or whatever, you're paying probably about as much as if you were buying like an $800,000 practice then, right?
Yes. I mean, I mean, if you look at that's another thing. Look at the amortization schedule, because there's another column that I didn't mention that actually shows you how much out of pocket you're paying, right, over the life of the loan. So you can go through and you could look and say, man, if I can find a way to pay this thing off in 7 years, I'm going to save myself $60,000 of interest. So don't just sign a loan and put your head down and just forget about it. I'm a firm believer of paying your debt down correctly, and interest rates are very low right now. Still, they've gone up a little bit since the last year or so, but you got to keep a historical perspective. I mean, even if let's say right now, I think startup interest rates are probably falling high 4s to high 5s, even low 6s, typically for a scratch startup. And so that might sound high when you compare it to somebody who got an acquisition loan 2 years ago at 4.25% or 3.99%. But keep some perspective. Look at 1980 when the prime rate was 20%. Look at 1990. These rates are still extremely low. You don't want to be in a huge hurry paying this debt off, because it's one of the only tax write-offs left is that interest. But you need to find a happy medium, and that happens on the front end during the due diligence process by putting yourself into a loan that gives you some outs. Most of these loans are going to have a 5-year prepayment penalty, George. So, if you've got a loan that's almost negatively amortizing for almost 2 years, and let's say you're, rocking and rolling by year 3 and 4, and you want to start paying it down aggressively, or you want to try to refinance it, maybe, rates will probably be higher then, but nobody knows. You're going to be kind of locked in there for at least 5 years. So this is at least a 5-year marriage. So, it is important to do your homework, really share the amortization schedules and the entire process with your CPA. They are by far the best person who is on your side to really evaluate and make sure that you've put the right loan product in with your future plans.
I think you're making a great point. And, there's 2 things I want to talk about, and I'm kind of conflicted as to which one I want to prioritize. But I really want to get into this point because it's fascinating to me. I guess I never realized the effect of that long, delayed payment structure of a startup, because when you think about it, a big draw to the startup, a lot of people feel like it's you can get a practice for $500,000 as opposed to acquiring a practice for much more than that potentially. So, but really, when you think about it, those first 2 years, you have very minimal cash flow in the first place. And then, when you get your cash flow, your loan payment is equivalent to that of a, $800,000 practice.
Yes.
So I think that I never realized that until right now, actually, where in fact, if you really want to think about it that way, you're really buying like an $800,000 practice because you're spending 2 years building it, and then you're paying for an $800,000 practice later.
Yeah, and think about kind of the flip side to that is, once that graduated period is over after 2 years, month 25, you've got this full payment, and that payment, like you just said, is going to be the equivalent still of a $500,000 loan after 2 years. So, and so that would usually cause, and I've gotten a lot of those phone calls from doctors that have been in a startup. I know B of A was doing like a 15-year startup program for a while, and they get to year 3 or 4, and they're just looking down the line and they want to get out of it, but now they've got a prepayment penalty to deal with, So it's kind of a necessary, I don't want to say evil. It's a necessary thing because you need to ramp up, for the first couple of years. But you're exactly right. You're basically financing on $500,000. I look at it almost as a $700,000 acquisition.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, when they think about debt, they think about the grand number as opposed to the cash flow or on a monthly basis what it affects them at. And I think it can either be very scary or it could be, comforting to know that they don't have a lot of debt. But anyway, I totally digress. The question that's probably more relevant to our listeners is, we've talked about the effect of the amortization schedule. I think that's one of the most important things to look at when you're looking at a loan package. The other one that I think is maybe more important to someone like me who's, frugal or whatever, as you're looking to spend your money, is the freedom and the discretion at which you can spend your funds. There's something in the startup loans where there's like an allocation to so much for construction, so much for your furniture, and they kind of budget out for you what you are able to spend your money on, and then you have additional money that you can spend kind of in a category. And I think for people who are trying to find maybe discounts on things, buying used equipment, or maybe like I had one of my buddies bought a lot of stuff off Craigslist, that might be harder with your loan package and the restrictions, because a lot of times the business has to invoice your bank and then your bank pays the business. So can you talk about that for a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. And, it for me, I like to break up a startup project into three categories of need, right? You're going to have your equipment, your Pattersons, your Shines, your Burkharts of the world. That's typically the equipment. Then you're going to have your build out, your contractor expense, your fixtures. That's a second category. And then you're going to have your third category, which is working capital. That is cash that is dispersed directly to the doctor. Those first two categories that I spoke about, the doctors are not going to be in control of those funds. The bank is going to want to pay those vendors directly and disperse those funds directly. And so, we're typically going to be okay with used equipment, but we want to make sure that it's with a reputable reseller, or, there are reps and warranties involved. Something like a Craigslist situation or a bunch of private party sales. That's a lot. That'll make a bank and an underwriter's head explode, just because we have no say in that process. We don't have the bandwidth to go out and inspect the equipment or really know that our client understands the ins and outs of the equipment, that they're, able to look at it mechanically and make sure that it's up to snuff. So the private party sales, can be a real challenge, and you'll probably get some pushback. I think most banks will, let's say you've got $250,000 allotted towards your equipment budget. I would say that, most banks would get comfortable allowing a certain percentage of that to be a private party sale, but they're not going to be comfortable with all of it. So maybe you figure out, okay, where can I get the biggest bang for my buck? Maybe I've got a buddy in my study club who's got a piano that's 5 years old, and, I can buy it from him. And oftentimes, the big resellers or the big equipment companies, they also sell used equipment. They're always coming out with new upgrades, and people are looking to trade things in. So talk to your local equipment reps about that. But to come back around, George, the construction expense and the equipment expense, banks are going to have their hands all over that. The working capital can generally just be a percentage of what those other quote unquote tangible assets would be. So a good ratio is typically about 20%. Most banks are going to max out at maybe 25%. So let's say your equipment and leasehold improvement budget comes to $400,000. Typically, the max amount of working capital that a bank's going to get comfortable with is going to be 20% to 25% on top of that. So you're probably looking at, 80 to 100 grand in working capital at that point. Working capital is typically, what's going to be used for everything from attorney's fees, consulting fees, architectural fees, and then making sure that you've got operating capital once you open your doors to cover payroll, your lease expense, et cetera.
Great, Morgan. And I understand that from the banking's perspective. I by no means am I advocating anybody go spend $200,000 on Craigslist. But sure. I just, from my perspective as somebody looking to do a startup, if I was in that situation, I would want freedom and flexibility to spend the loan money as if I saw fit. And I understand from your perspective that that's not always possible. I just kind of wanted to have a conversation about it, and I appreciate you clearing that up. One last question for you. So,
and George, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think you just made a really good point. I mean, your banking relationship needs to be just that, a relationship. And so all of your listeners right now that are thinking about going into startups or are talking to banks now about startups, talk to them about these specific things on the first phone call. Bring it up early in the process and tell them, hey, I'm planning on buying some new equipment, but I've got a lot of used equipment, private party equipment that's earmarked that is a great deal. And I know what I'm doing, and I need to find a bank that will partner with me and trust me on these things. If you bring this stuff up to a banker, a good banker early on in the process, and we're able to build that into our story and into our write-up and then talk to the underwriter about it, and maybe we show them that you've done your research and all that. That's what a good banker does, is they prepare a good package and present a good package to underwriting. And most banks will have, some of that flexibility, if you guys are upfront with the bank from the very first call and let them in on your plans. That is something I think that some banks will be flexible with.
Man, you brought up another thing I want to talk about, but I think I'm running out of time. I got one more question for you, Morgan. So let's just say you were able to negotiate a good lease and you get a lot of tenant improvements. how does the bank factor into that? Are you free to use your tenant improvements as working capital once you get it? Or at what point does the bank have involvement in the tenant improvements?
Sure. So, every situation is different. And again, this goes back to making sure that you align yourself with your own representation on the commercial real estate side, right? Because a startup is more important than anything else, acquisitions, anything, because again, you're starting from scratch. And so to be able to go in and negotiate yourself, a healthy, price per square foot that the landlord's going to contribute, or even, I would say even better yet, sometimes, figure out what they want to contribute and then convert that into 6 months of free rent, because typically you will have a bank that is willing to step up on the leasehold improvements that it takes to get the doors open. So if you can get somebody, instead of getting, $40,000 of leasehold improvements chipped in by the landlord, if you can convert that over to, depending on the market, 8, 12 months of free rent, that might be something that is really attractive. Then you would basically have no loan payment, no lease payment for 3 to 6 months. But I digress myself. That's absolutely important. And that's exactly why it's so important to have representation and somebody knows how to negotiate. I can't tell you how many times, George, I've talked to a doctor that said, I drove by this space and I liked it. And I called the landlord up and he said he's going to, his representation or his property manager is going to draw up a great deal for me. I mean, that'd be like going and buying a home without having any representation. It just doesn't make sense. These guys know what the market can bear. They know the absolute maximum that they can squeeze out of a landlord. And you guys need to understand that you're valuable. You're going to be signing a 5+5 lease, where you guarantee that you're going to be there 5 years plus a 5-year option. Dentists don't move around. They're great tenants. And so you guys got to understand that you are attractive to the landlord and it needs to be represented as such.
Totally. And I think that's a great place to, leave off. I think in a lot of ways, having the right representation is incredibly important. I think we touched on that a lot in this episode. And I think banking is no different. So I appreciate you, Morgan, for coming on. I really love what you guys are doing at Lendeavor. And so, again, I'll leave a link to Lendeavor in the show notes if any of you guys are interested. And I appreciate you coming on, Morgan.
My pleasure, George. Thank you so much for your support.
All right, Jonas. So great interview with Morgan. As I expected when I started, when I interviewed him, I thought it'd be great. And it was, we were talking off air about lending for startups. You were kind of talking about Lendeavor, and you talked about what it'd be like lending for startups. And so I wanted to get your perspective on this. And you kind of started talking. I stopped you, and so I'll let you continue right now. So
sure. I was saying you can imagine the struggles for anybody that would, offer or vet somebody enough to give them $500,000. I know you have a dental degree, but what else qualifies you to receive $500,000 to guarantee to get paid back? Imagine the struggle of being able to do that.
Yeah, and I mean for a startup specifically too, because there's all you have to go off of is literally a building, and just where the building is located is really all that that lender has confidence in, and they're banking on the dentist to make everything happen.
You're right. And I mean, demographics only mean so much. You can put, you put somebody in there who doesn't know how to put this thing all together. I mean, they keep on a timeline and get open and talk to the right people because, I mean, they oversee you, but they don't hold your hand. So I can imagine the struggle for companies out there to or the hesitation to loan out to startups. And that'd be a big jump.
Yeah, but let's not try to persuade Lendeavor against doing startups in our outro here.
I think it's great, man. They sign me up. I mean, as soon as they do, I'm in. I would love to get another avenue of getting financing for startups. Man, that'd be fantastic.
No, but in terms of your startup, so when you were going through the financing process, what were some of the terms? So I had asked Morgan in the interview, what are some of the terms that you're looking for as potential financer or somebody receiving financing? What kind of things are important to you other than just the interest rate and the total amount they're giving you?
Okay, so you mentioned interest rate is obviously number one. That's what you're going to negotiate against. And actually, I have a cool write up on Dental Town back in the day about how I negotiated my rate. And I negotiated so early in my process that we had to renew this thing probably 4 or 5 times before he even started lending to me. But some of the terms you want to look for is that there's actually two interest rates. There's one you're going to have after closing the loan, and then there's another interest rate that people don't think about, and that's the one that is going to accrue monthly during the build-out process. If you knew that or not, but as soon as they start giving you money, there's a ongoing interest rate that's going to be charging you, and this is a monthly interest rate while you're actively withdrawing that money as you're developing the loan amount. So, and that rate is actually negotiable. So that's important. Guarantors, obviously they're going to make you guarantee it no matter what. It'd be fantastic to not have to guarantee it. I'd love to find a bank for you that didn't require that. Other one's going to be payback terms. So there's going to be either payback over an amount of years, or there's going to be a balloon payment. Me personally, I would probably never do a balloon payment. It's not set in stone. Obviously, you can take out another loan to pay the balloon payment, or refinance the loan altogether down the line if you don't have any restrictions on refinancing it. But I would shy away from, even if interest rate was extremely low, from any kind of balloon payment, because 3 years down the road, who's going to say you have $500,000 saved in the bank for just a balloon payment to come up?
And you don't know the value of your practice at that point, where you could trust that you're really banking on another lender giving you a loan if you don't have that kind of liquidity. So yeah, definitely not a good situation to be in.
No, not at all. So yeah, those are important. So how you're going to pay it back. Do you know anybody that's taking a balloon payment?
I'm taking a balloon payment. So. Oh, yeah, okay. All right. But it's different. I'm taking a balloon payment for a seller financing portion of the acquisition that we're buying. Okay. So it's a.
That is different. That's significantly different. But then also the restrictions on when you can or cannot pay it back.
Yeah. So that was a big negotiating point for us. Was our sellers wanted the balloon payment to be further up. We were pushing it back. Because I needed to have certainty that I could either refinance and get that taken care of, or I had enough time to save up in the event that I can't get outside lending to cover that balloon payment, because at that point they could take away your whole practice if you can't pay back the balloon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a big one. Just the terms of repayment, pay close attention to, what's the maximum you can pay back on a loan per year without being hit by a penalty. What's the fastest way you can pay it back without receiving a penalty? All those things. And, can you refinance it or not? Because technically refinancing is considered paying back the loan. So,
and I wanted to bring up a point, Jonas. So I'm probably going to send out, if I haven't already, one of our email newsletter articles is going to be about this point, but I wanted to talk to you about it because in the episode we talked about, there's with the startup. So I have a delayed payback. I get like up to 6 months interest only payments because I'm buying a practice, and then after the 6 months I got to pay my full payment. So with a startup, that grace period of the loan is exaggerated greatly. Like it's like, I think Lendeavor, we were talking in the episode, like 2 years of subsidized, if you want to call them, payments, where they're delaying the payback of your loan. So how long?
Graduated payments.
Exactly. So how long was your total loan term when you signed it?
Mine is probably, I think it's 11 years.
Okay.
And with a 6 month holiday from the time I opened doors to and then graduate payments for the first maybe 3 years until we're at full payments.
So think about that. So your loan closes, and for 3.5 years, you're not making the full payment. Yep. So, from year 4 to year 11, you're paying for, your debt service it kind of makes your startup more expensive than it actually is if you think about it, right?
It's basically just interest.
Yeah.
What I'm paying.
Yeah, exactly, for that time period. And then at that point, you're paying, so I don't know, I guess that really changed the way I thought about the cost of a startup. Because I've always thought of it as like, $500,000. So you compare, what can you get for $500,000 doing a startup versus an acquisition? That's kind of always the way that people think about it. But that that way that you pay back the loan kind of changed the way I thought about it. Where now, a startup is a little bit more expensive because the time where you're having to, graduated payments, you're not making a whole lot of money anyway. That's kind of the equity building period. And then once you have that equity, you're now paying off a loan that would be higher payments because you're paying it off in a shorter period of time than, if they had done the full amortization schedule as if it would be, 11 years with no graduated payments. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I worked it out. It was maybe in terms just altogether interest on top, like total amount I pay on a loan. You can't quote me because it's been a while since I looked at it, but it was probably 150, almost 200 over the total loan amount for sure. So what you're saying, I can kind of put numbers to it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we were talking about in the episode. Like a $500,000 startup is really like a $700,000 acquisition because of that timeline difference.
Yeah,
and that never clicked to me until that interview, and I just think that's a very valuable point that maybe I've never heard it before, and I mean I don't know, I can't believe it hasn't occurred to me until that interview, but I think it's significant. So that was something that I hope you guys took away from the interview. This was a really good one. I really liked it. So I hope you guys did too. Next week we got a really good one with Jonas and Tim. So we'll get into that one next week. But thank you guys for listening to the Shared Practices podcast. See you next time.